Imagine stepping off a train into a world of snow, expecting cruelty, fear, and suffering, but finding warmth, kindness, and moments of humanity instead. During World War II, German POWs sent to America never anticipated the shock of their first snowfall or the unexpected generosity of the people around them. From snow-laden barracks to playful encounters with local children, their experiences challenge everything they had been taught about the enemy. Today, on Battlefield Secrets, we uncover the story of fear, culture shock, and the fragile beauty of humanity amidst war. Stay with us, because what these prisoners faced will surprise you. The railcar creaked and groaned under the weight of 32 German prisoners, huddled together against the biting winter chill. Frost clung to the narrow windows in jagged, white patterns, partially obscuring the landscape beyond. Outside, the American Midwest stretched in an unbroken expanse of snow fields, forests, and frozen rivers catching the gray light of a low winter sun. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scent of damp wool, leather boots, and anxious bodies pressed against each other for warmth. Each man wore a combination of faded military overcoats and layers of undergarments, some patched hastily in previous encampments, others still bearing the insignia of units long disbanded. Their boots were caked in dried mud from European winters, now dampened by melting snow tracked in from station platforms, and woolen gloves were worn thin from constant use. The clatter of iron wheels on steel rails provided a relentless rhythm, each jolt sending a shiver through the cramped car. Rumors had traveled ahead of them. Harsh American winters, merciless guards, and camps designed to break the spirit. These whispers, mingled with half-remembered propaganda, weighed heavily on their minds. Private Klaus Weber, 23, pressed his forehead against the frosted glass, trying to make out the world outside. The fields appeared silent, untouched, a muted white stretching to the horizon. In Germany, winters had been merciless, gray, and scarred by shellfire. Yet this landscape held an unsettling calm. Snow-laden towns appeared at intervals, small clusters of wooden houses with smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Weber's mind wavered between relief and suspicion. Beauty in wartime, he reasoned, was never without cost. Conversations in the car were muted, whispers confined to shared fears. One soldier recounted the journey from the port of New York inland toward the Midwest, noting the stops at Cleveland, Chicago, and small towns along the way. Each mention of a town's name carried imagined horrors: guards enforcing rigid discipline, families hostile to the idea of enemy prisoners in their midst. Yet as the train passed through open countryside, the reality before them seemed disarmingly benign. Horses pawed snow-covered fields. Children's faint laughter could be heard from the distance, muffled but real. Others, like Unteroffizier Heinrich Bauer, tried to recall the harsh winters of the North Atlantic transport, when waves had frozen against the ship's hull and sea spray turned to ice on faces. Compared to that, this journey felt strange, almost gentle. Still, Bauer's mind refused to accept calm as ordinary. Every curve of the rail, every glimmering tree, seemed like a prelude to some concealed trial. The men shifted uneasily as the train slowed, signaling the approach of the camp. The first signs of organized human habitation, snow-cleared paths, fences, and clustered barracks appeared in the distance, their symmetry at odds with the chaotic war the prisoners had left behind. The quiet beauty of the winter landscape clashed with expectations of brutality. Eyes met across the car, reflecting a shared, unspoken thought. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated, or perhaps danger had simply taken a different, subtler form. Frost-laden windows fogged with breath as silence settled over the railcar. Each man turned inward, wrestling with a mixture of relief and dread. The snow-covered land stretched endlessly ahead, serene and indifferent to the men trapped within the moving metal box. Outside, the faint glimmer of the camp came into view, a rigid collection of buildings surrounded by barbed wire. The train slowed further, every creak and rattle magnifying the suspense that gripped them. In the stillness, Klaus Weber wondered aloud, a question half to himself, half to the frozen landscape outside. Would this cold land bring suffering or something entirely unexpected? The answer remained hidden behind the white veil, as the train crept steadily toward the unknown. The train hissed to a reluctant stop, its brakes groaning under the winter cold. Outside, the world was a uniform white, soft and undisturbed, as if the war had yet to leave its mark here. German POWs pressed against the frost-rimmed windows, blinking at the scene beyond. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows, their rooftops glimmering with fresh snow, appeared almost picturesque. Barbed wire fences encircled the camp perimeter, the metal glinting in the pale morning light, frost crystals forming along each strand. The orderly arrangement of watchtowers and gates suggested discipline, but not the brutality the men had been trained to expect. 32 prisoners remained huddled in each railcar, bundled in layers of worn overcoats, threadbare gloves, and scarves that smelled faintly of damp wool. Their boots left slushy imprints on the boards of the car as they shifted anxiously, reluctant to step outside. Guards in heavy winter coats, wool caps, and thick gloves patrolled the platform, rifles slung at their sides. Their movements were deliberate but unhurried, a contrast to the soldiers' imagined ferocity. Occasionally, a guard bent to clear snow from the path, his boots crunching over the frozen ground, leaving neat lines of footprints. Corporal Dieter Muller was the first to venture a cautious step onto the platform, his breath puffing in clouds that mingled with the icy mist. He felt the compacted snow underfoot and paused, taking in the surreal quiet. The usual cacophony of trains, orders, and clanging equipment seemed muffled beneath the soft weight of winter. Beyond the immediate camp, open fields reflected the low winter sun, and a distant tree line traced a stark silhouette against the pale sky. Children's voices, distant and indistinct, reached the camp from nearby farmsteads, carried faintly across the still air. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Expectations of cruelty were ingrained, the product of months of propaganda and fear. Yet the reality challenged their assumptions. Barracks were orderly but not oppressive. Smoke spiraled from small chimneys, suggesting warmth and domestic routine inside. Snow-covered paths had been cleared with care, not left treacherous as a form of control. The guards did not shout, did not strike, nor make men line up under a blistering wind. Instead, they moved with efficiency, maintaining order without intimidation. Muller crouched to examine footprints in the snow, small impressions from previous arrivals, perhaps from earlier prisoners or camp staff. Even the barbed wire, while forbidding, seemed more a precaution than a weapon of fear. He noted the frozen fences stretching into the distance, creating neat geometric patterns that, in another context, might have inspired admiration rather than dread. Every detail contradicted the mental image he had carried, a harsh, unyielding winter filled with suffering. Whispers passed among the men as they shuffled toward the exit. Some expressed disbelief, others a tentative awe. Hans Keller, older and more cynical, muttered about a trap, warning that beauty in wartime was rarely genuine. Yet the stillness and the apparent care of the Americans created an internal tension that was difficult to dismiss. Was this calm a temporary reprieve, a calculated illusion, or had their expectations been wrong all along? The prisoners stood at the threshold of the camp, snow crunching beneath their boots, eyes scanning the orderly rows of barracks and the carefully spaced watchtowers. The silence of the snow-laden landscape pressed against their ears, and a subtle unease settled alongside wonder. Could beauty exist where they expected only brutality? The question lingered unspoken, each man wrestling with the unfamiliar sensation of relief tempered by suspicion as the camp serene, frozen, and strange awaited their first tentative steps inside. The first steps onto the snow-crusted ground were tentative, each POW testing the firmness beneath his boots as if it might betray him. Wooden barracks rose in orderly rows, their roofs laden with a thick coat of snow, chimneys sending slender plumes of smoke into the pale winter sky. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter, tall and silent, their silhouettes etched against the horizon. Beyond the camp, fields stretched in gentle white expanses, occasionally interrupted by a frozen stream glinting faintly under the low sun, or by the dark line of distant evergreens. The world seemed paused, hushed beneath a blanket of frost, as if time itself had adopted the discipline of the camp. Private Karl Richter took a cautious step forward, his gloved hand brushing against the wooden rail of a snow-covered fence. The wood was cold, rigid, and smooth under the frost. He paused, observing the footprints that traced paths to and from the barracks, small, precise, almost reverent in their symmetry. The camp was larger than he had imagined. Dozens of barracks, several watchtowers, a central mess hall, and a cluster of sheds near the edge of the fields for labor and storage. Each structure spoke of order, not cruelty, a stark contrast to the images he had carried in his mind since leaving Europe. Other prisoners followed, some tentative, others emboldened by the quiet beauty of the snow. A few bent to scoop up handfuls, tossing them gently into the air. The soft flake drifted downward, silent against the crisp wind, and for the first time, a faint smile broke across Richter's face. He quickly suppressed it, remembering the unspoken code among the men. Joy in captivity was dangerous, a betrayal of the war's discipline. Yet, even as guilt prickled his conscience, he could not deny the sensation. The snow was soft, clean, and pure, and it invited an instinctive playfulness he had not felt since childhood. Frozen streams carved delicate patterns through the landscape, their surfaces smooth enough to reflect the pale sky. Small birds flitted between bare branches, their faint chirping carrying across the snow. The prisoners noted these touches of life with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. In Europe, the winters had been gray, harsh, and scarred by destruction. Here, nature seemed untouched, almost serene. The contrast was unsettling. Each man felt the subtle tension of guilt beneath awe, an internal conflict intensified by the apparent civility of the Americans. Guards moved quietly through the camp, performing routine checks and clearing paths, their presence vigilant but not threatening. Corporal Wilhelm Hahn lingered near the edge of the field, observing the careful symmetry of the snow-laden fences and the delicate icicles forming along the eaves of barracks. He thought of the long nights spent in cold, crowded cells aboard transport ships, of rations measured and withheld, of the harsh words of officers who believed fear was the only tool of discipline. And yet, here in the silent whiteness, the world felt absurdly calm, almost inviting. The cognitive dissonance was disorienting. He felt joy and fear in equal measure, unsure if either emotion was appropriate. The men continued to explore, shuffling through drifts, leaving footprints that would soon be erased by wind or snow. Each step was careful, a negotiation between curiosity and caution. They observed how snow clung to fences and rooftops, how sunlight glinted on frozen streams, and how small patches of wildlife persisted despite the cold. Even as they marveled, the guilt remained a constant reminder that happiness in captivity might be considered treachery to the war and to those waiting at home. As the group gathered near the central barracks, a silence fell over them, thick with awe and apprehension. For a fleeting moment, childlike wonder mingled with the tension of captivity. The prisoners' eyes met across the snow, acknowledging without words the unfamiliar sensation, beauty, stillness, and playfulness amidst the rigid confines of war. Can one permit joy in a world defined by war? The question remained unspoken, lingering in the cold air, as the men trudged through the drifts toward the mess hall, uncertain whether the snow's invitation to innocence was a gift or a test. The snow-crusted path led the German prisoners beyond the immediate confines of the camp, into the vast, quiet expanse of American farmland. Fields stretched uninterrupted, white and luminous under the muted winter sun, their fences outlined delicately with frost. Occasionally, a barn or farmhouse punctuated the horizon, smoke spiraling lazily from chimneys, a testament to human presence amid the untouched landscape. Streams, thin and glittering under sheets of ice, meandered like silver threads, reflecting the pale sky. The prisoners noted the contrast immediately. Here was a winter unmarred by battle, a stillness foreign after years of war-torn Europe. Private Dietrich Lang, gloved hands stuffed deep into his pockets, wandered near a frozen creek, observing how the water shimmered beneath its icy covering. In Germany, he had grown accustomed to winter fields scarred by trenches and bombed villages. Here, the snow lay smooth, almost reverent, masking nothing but reflecting everything. Forests in the distance held tall pines, dusted with frost, their dark silhouettes stark against the sky. The wind carried no acrid smoke, no distant artillery, only the faint rustle of birds moving between branches. Small tracks, squirrel or rabbit, traced delicate patterns through the snow, unnoticed by the casual observer, but immediately significant to the soldiers, symbols of life persisting even in winter. Corporal Heinrich Bauer led a small group down a country road that had been cleared, the edges piled with soft snowbanks. Wooden fences, some leaning slightly, crisscrossed the farmland, enclosing pastures where cattle huddled together for warmth. Every detail, the scale of the fields, the clean straight roads, the unspoiled vistas, struck a nerve. Memories of shattered villages, collapsed roofs, and debris-strewn streets came unbidden, making the perfection before them seem almost impossible. The air was crisp, almost fragrant, scented faintly with wood smoke and pine, stirring a nostalgia he could not name, for a home both near and impossibly distant. The soldiers' initial caution slowly gave way to tentative observation. They kicked lightly at the snow, watching the powdery flakes scatter and settle again, its quiet resilience reminiscent of an innocence that had been denied them for years. Every footstep, every breath visible in the frigid air, reminded them of their presence in a world that did not conform to their expectations of enmity. Even as awe crept into their faces, a subtle unease persisted. Nature's beauty, so pristine, seemed to accentuate the absurdity of their situation. How could a land so untouched by human cruelty exist while Europe burned? As they moved closer to a copse of trees, Bauer's gaze lingered on a distant farmhouse where children briefly appeared at a window, waving before retreating behind heavy curtains. The gesture, simple and unguarded, brought a pang of longing, mingled with guilt. The prisoners were trained to see enemies in every smile. Yet here, gestures of kindness were subtle, innocuous, yet deeply unsettling. The pristine landscape magnified this sensation, emphasizing both the distance from home and the unexpected generosity of those around them. The group paused near the banks of a frozen stream, their reflections faintly visible on the ice, distorted by frost patterns. Silence settled, the only sound the soft crunch of boots and occasional whisper of wind through the pines. For a brief moment, they felt the freedom of sight and motion, the ability to appreciate beauty without fear of reprisal. And yet, each man carried the weight of duty, propaganda, and fear of judgment. Could nature's beauty exist untouched by the chaos of war? The question remained unspoken but resonant, echoing through the snow-laden fields and forests. Each prisoner, in his own way, wrestled with wonder, nostalgia, and the unsettling realization that kindness, both human and natural, might redefine the boundaries of their understanding of the world. The camp was unusually quiet that morning, as if the freshly fallen snow had absorbed the usual clatter of boots and shouted commands. German POWs huddled near the edge of the central yard, observing the scene with cautious curiosity. Wooden barracks lined the rectangular expanse, their rooftops frosted and chimneys emitting thin wisps of smoke. Watchtowers loomed at each corner, guards in heavy winter coats and wool caps patrolling methodically, their rifles resting lightly against their shoulders. Yet despite the weapons, there was an absence of harshness, no shouted orders, no striking of prisoners, only the crisp sound of boots crunching over snow and the soft scraping of shovels against icy pathways. Private Otto Fischer pressed a mittened hand to the frosted railing, squinting at the guards as one helped another across a particularly slippery stretch of ground. The simple act a hand offered, steadying a comrade, drew Otto's attention more than any overtly military display. Nearby, camp staff swept snow from the central walkways, forming neat lanes through which prisoners would later pass to the mess hall. Outside the perimeter, small clusters of local townsfolk, clad in heavy coats and scarves, cleared paths around farmhouses, guided livestock through the snow, and carried bundles of firewood. The Americans' movements were methodical, efficient, yet there was a deliberate care, a subtle warmth, that caught the prisoners off guard. Corporal Heinrich Bauer stood at the corner of the barracks, watching as a guard paused to adjust a struggling prisoner's scarf, tightening it against the bitter wind. The prisoner, uncertain, glanced at the gesture and murmured thanks, an unfamiliar sound in the disciplined environment. Bauer's chest tightened. The simple human concern jarred with everything he had been taught. In Europe, Such gestures between captor and captive were rare, often laced with suspicion. Here, in the midst of frost and white, they seemed genuine. The prisoners noted details they might have overlooked in less serene circumstances. Snow lay in undisturbed sheets along fence lines, cleared meticulously from paths leading to feed barns and latrines. Horses, their coats thick and well-groomed, waited patiently as caretakers adjusted harnesses or led them toward barns. Even the small gestures of civility, the passing of a bucket, the clearing of ice from a trough, felt amplified against the backdrop of a silent, white landscape. Each act seemed magnified, almost conspicuous, a pattern of care that made the POWs question motives and meaning alike. Yet the calm carried with it a subtle tension. Private Carl Richter murmured to a comrade about the possibility of deceit, the camp's beauty and order perhaps a mask for psychological manipulation. Other prisoners nodded in agreement, faces tight with worry, eyes flicking between guards and distant townsfolk. The snow, so pure and quiet, seemed to emphasize every detail, every smile, every courtesy, every unobtrusive correction of a fellow human. It was unnerving. How could ordinary kindness exist in a world defined by war and propaganda? The men moved in clusters, shuffling cautiously along cleared paths, watching interactions without participation. Their curiosity was tempered by instinctual caution. The unfamiliarity of civility bred both admiration and suspicion. Each prisoner carried the unspoken question: could acts of humanity be trusted when all else, the global conflict, indoctrination, and fear, pointed toward cruelty? As shadows lengthened across the snow-covered barracks, the camp's quiet stretched, leaving the prisoners suspended between wonder and wariness. The dichotomy gnawed at them: the serene efficiency of American care versus the expectations of cruelty drilled into them over years of conflict. Every glance, every gesture seemed to hover on the edge of intent and illusion. Can acts of humanity be trusted when all else is war? The question remained, unspoken but heavy, as the POWs retraced their steps through the frost-lined paths, each man silently weighing admiration against suspicion, uncertainty settling over them like a second layer of snow. The barracks were quiet, the usual clatter of boots and shouts replaced by the muffled rustle of paper and the occasional scratch of pen on cold wood. Frost clung to the narrow windows, and every exhaled breath hovered as a visible cloud in the chill air. German POWs sat at long, utilitarian tables, hunched over sheets of paper, each attempting to convey both mundane detail and suppressed emotion to family back home. Ink froze near the edges of the pages, curling faintly, and letters were often written in fits and pauses as hands stiffened from the cold. Private Wilhelm Kruger stared at the pristine snow blanketing the courtyard outside. The calm whiteness contrasted painfully with memories of winter in the Rhineland, bombed-out streets, broken rooftops, and families shivering in unheated rooms. The irony was not lost on him here. He was safe, warm enough, surrounded by abundance, while home suffered deprivation and destruction. Each word he wrote carried a weight he could scarcely articulate, a mixture of longing, guilt, and fear that his letters might never reach their intended recipients. Censorship was a constant concern. Camp regulations dictated that letters be inspected for sensitive content, and any hint of dissatisfaction or subversion could be excised or delayed. POWs chose words cautiously, aware that even honest descriptions of camp life, particularly the generosity of Americans, might be misunderstood by family or authorities back in Germany. Kruger paused, pen hovering above the page, wondering if he could ever express the surreal contrast. The serene, snow-covered fields outside, the careful civility of guards, and the warmth of meals and barracks, juxtaposed against the devastation he imagined at home. Corporal Heinrich Bauer, seated across the table, dipped his pen and tried to maintain composure as he wrote about the weather, masking the awe he felt at the gentle snowfall outside. He described streets and buildings, carefully omitting details that might suggest abundance or kindness. Yet, in the back of his mind, he admitted a secret wish that the snow might linger, that transport back to Europe could be delayed. The thought conflicted violently with his ingrained sense of duty. Could he, in some small way, allow himself a reprieve at the expense of loyalty to his homeland? the guilt coiled tightly around his chest. As their pens scratched against paper, the men observed small details in the barracks. Steam rising from cups of thin soup, a draft slipping under the door, the quiet hum of the heating stove struggling against winter's chill. Outside, the landscape remained untouched, each flake of snow reflecting light in sharp relief. The juxtaposition created an almost surreal emotional tension, beauty and calm outside, destruction and loss inside their minds. The world seemed to offer them peace, yet peace felt illicit, a stolen sensation. Letters were folded carefully, addressed meticulously, and handed to waiting guards for processing. Each envelope was a paradox, a message of connection to a home that might no longer exist, and a confession of emotion that could not be shared openly. Some POWs lingered over their writing, knowing that in the silence of winter, in the gentle drifting of snow across the courtyard, they felt more alive than they had in years, yet more estranged from the duty and loyalty that were demanded. Kruger closed his letter and stared once more at the snow-laden fields beyond the barracks. He imagined the devastation waiting for him thousands of miles away and, for the first time, wondered if prolonging his stay, even secretly wishing it was a moral failing or the only path to preserve his fragile sense of self. How can one reconcile joy with loyalty to a homeland in ruins? The question hung in the cold air, unanswered, as the prisoners tucked their letters into envelopes and prepared to leave the warmth of their tables, carrying both hope and unease into the winter day. The courtyard beyond the barracks had become a stage of muted activity, where snow-covered ground met the edge of the camp fence. German POWs observed from a cautious distance as local children appeared, bundled in thick coats, woolen scarves, and knitted hats, their cheeks flushed bright from the cold. Boots crunched over snowbanks, mittens clutched handfuls of powdery snow, and laughter, crisp and high-pitched, carried across the icy air. The prisoners watched, initially hesitant, uncertain whether to engage or retreat into familiar suspicion. Private Otto Fisher noticed a small boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, approach the fence carrying a loaf of homemade bread wrapped in coarse paper. The child's eyes were wide, earnest, unguarded, a stark contrast to the faces Fisher had grown accustomed to during years of conflict. Another girl, holding a carved wooden toy horse, mimicked throwing a snowball toward the prisoners, though it fell short, a gentle gesture more than play. The prisoners exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. In Germany, such innocence was rare during wartime. Distrust was ingrained even in children. Here, the gestures felt startling, almost unnatural. Corporal Heinrich Bauer stepped cautiously forward, brushing snow from his coat, and accepted the bread with a quiet nod. The warmth of the child's smile penetrated the frost, stirring a pang of guilt and wonder. Each interaction, the offering of bread, the gentle tossing of snowballs, the shy bow of a girl became a small probe into the possibility of genuine human kindness. The POWs' minds raced. Could this trust, this innocence, be real, or was it an extension of carefully orchestrated civility? The children's clothing reflected the era and locale. Heavy wool coats with large buttons, hand-knit scarves threaded loosely around small necks, thick mittens sewn with bright patterns, and leather boots dusted with snow. Their toys were simple but cherished: wooden animals, small dolls, carved figurines, and slingshots fashioned from tree branches. Each detail conveyed care, family attention, and a life relatively untouched by war, emphasizing a cultural contrast that unsettled the prisoners. As the POWs tentatively responded, some kneeling to return smiles or pick up stray snowballs, a subtle psychological tension emerged. Warmth mingled with guilt, amusement intertwined with unease. The innocence of children, untainted by propaganda, magnified internal conflict. The prisoners were trained to see Americans as enemies. Yet here was proof of humanity unmediated by conflict. Memories of their own siblings, long separated by war, surfaced unbidden, and with them a sense of longing and melancholy. Hans Keller, leaning against the snow-laden fence, observed a girl carefully placing her wooden horse on the windowsill of a nearby barracks. "She trusts us," he whispered to Bauer, "and we are supposed to be enemies." The statement hung in the cold air, uncomfortably true, the weight of moral contradiction pressing against the awe he felt. Every gift, Every shared laugh challenged preconceptions and created an internal dissonance that none of the men had anticipated. The snow continued to fall, soft flakes drifting onto coats, hair, and the wooden fences separating prisoner from civilian. In the quiet moments between playful gestures, the POWs felt an unfamiliar sensation, a sense of connection unmediated by fear, obligation, or command. Yet it was layered with unease, for the purity of these children's actions seemed almost fragile against the backdrop of war. Can the purity of youth ever be trusted in times of war? The question lingered as the prisoners slowly withdrew from the fence, the children waving after them, leaving small footprints in the snow, evidence of innocence, warmth, and a world that refused to be consumed entirely by conflict. The morning air bit sharply at the prisoners' faces as they stepped into the snow-blanketed farmyard. Each footfall crunched over frost-hardened paths, the cold seeping through worn wool socks and leather boots. German POWs were assigned to outdoor labor, shoveling snow from walkways, clearing ice from water troughs, and tending to livestock huddled against the wind in wooden barns. Their breath rose in thick clouds, mingling with the faint scent of hay and smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. The work was exhausting, yet methodical. Each shovel of snow and careful placement of feed was both a physical necessity and a lesson in unexpected order and civility. Private Otto Fischer gripped a wooden-handled shovel, scraping ice and snow from the narrow lane leading to the barn. The tool, simple yet sturdy, was typical of rural American farms, iron-tipped, well-maintained, with a smooth, polished handle. He marveled at the meticulous care with which the Americans had maintained their property. Fences were straight and intact, barns freshly whitewashed, and water troughs regularly checked even in the harshest cold. Here, diligence coexisted with kindness, a combination alien to soldiers accustomed to destruction and scarcity. Corporal Heinrich Bauer fed cattle huddled in a barn stall, scattering hay in even, measured layers. The animals, thick-coated and calm, accepted the feed without fear, a testament to the farmer's familiarity and care. Bauer noted that every gesture from adjusting a trough to clearing ice from drinking water was precise, fair, and methodical. The men had expected gruff, indifferent, or even hostile treatment. Yet here, the human hand revealed competence blended with quiet generosity. Each act of maintenance and oversight seemed to underscore the difference between expectation and reality. The prisoners worked alongside American farmhands, who offered occasional guidance without condescension. A man in a wool coat, hands reddened by cold, demonstrated how to break ice without harming the trough, pausing to smile and nod at the men. Such small courtesies provoked subtle, unanticipated reactions. Fisher felt a flicker of gratitude and, simultaneously, a pang of guilt. They had been trained to see Americans as enemies, yet the reality of shared labor and fairness challenged the rigidity of their indoctrination. Even the routines of rationing struck a surprising note. POWs received modest portions of warm food during breaks, thick soup, fresh bread, occasionally a small helping of meat. The warmth penetrated chilled bones, but more importantly, it reinforced an unexpected truth. Fairness existed even in captivity. No one had to wait in silence for scraps. No one was berated for minor missteps. Every measured gesture, from shovel placement to food distribution, contributed to a growing internal conflict. Exhaustion pressed against their muscles, yet the physical strain did little to dampen the mental stirrings the work evoked. The snow-covered fields glinted under a weak sun, the frost on fences and barn eaves refracting light in tiny prisms. Beauty and hardship coexisted in the same space. Each flake that melted on their gloves, each breath visible in cold air, reminded them that the world could be orderly, kind, and harsh all at once. As the prisoners trudged back toward the barracks, shoulders stiff and hands raw, an uneasy admiration lingered in their minds. Propaganda had taught them that enemies were cruel, that civility was a mask for malice. Yet the farmers' hands, roughened by snow and labor, had demonstrated care, real, unforced care. The juxtaposition unsettled them, creating tension between belief and observation, indoctrination and lived reality. Could the enemy's hands be capable of care rather than cruelty? The question shadowed their steps. Unanswered, as snowflakes continued to drift onto tired coats and frozen paths, leaving the prisoners to navigate both the icy fields and the more treacherous terrain of their own evolving perceptions. Snow blanketed the camp and surrounding farmland, transforming familiar barracks and fences into a canvas of white. As twilight fell, the POWs noticed faint flickers of light along the perimeter, candles set carefully in windows, lanterns suspended from wooden posts, and small bonfires in the yards of nearby farmhouses. The glow was subtle but persistent, inviting and utterly foreign to the prisoners, who had long associated warmth and light with tension or vigilance rather than celebration. Private Otto Fisher observed a small gathering of locals near the camp's edge. Children, cheeks flushed and bundled in thick coats, skated briefly on a frozen pond, occasionally throwing snowballs toward each other and the POWs at the fence. Men and women hummed or sang softly, voices blending with the crisp evening air. The sound was unfamiliar yet soothing, carrying rhythms and melodies that were distinctly American: folk tunes, winter carols, and occasional notes from a fiddle or harmonica. Fisher's breath came in clouds as he pressed against the frost-lined fence, uncertain how to interpret the scene. In Germany, during wartime, festive occasions were rare, subdued, or overshadowed by propaganda. Here, joy seemed almost reckless, daring even. Corporal Heinrich Bauer's attention was drawn to the tables laid out with small offerings baskets of freshly baked bread, thick slices of cured meat, fruit, and rudimentary sweets. Some trays bore simple candles, their flames flickering in the chill wind. Bauer's hands itched to reach for a morsel, yet he hesitated, the learned caution of a soldier warring with an emergent curiosity. The prisoners had been conditioned to expect hardship, deprivation, and disdain from their supposed enemies, and yet the scene suggested generosity, patience, and careful planning. A young girl approached the fence, carrying a small carved snow figure, a rudimentary snowman, with a scarf tied crookedly around its neck. She extended it toward Fisher with a shy, earnest smile. His first instinct was suspicion, but the innocence of the gesture softened his tension. Private Karl Richter, nearby, whispered to Bauer that the scene reminded him uncomfortably of family holidays, though the warmth of those memories now mingled with guilt and disbelief. Some men quietly accepted gifts, handling them as delicately as fragile glass, each moment layered with psychological complexity, joy, wonder, moral questioning. The atmosphere carried subtle tensions, laughter interwoven with uncertainty, candles flickering against the encroaching dark, music blending with the crunch of boots in snow. Each prisoner's thoughts flickered between the immediate delight of the celebration and memories of cold, gray winters back home. Some secretly noted that the joy felt more genuine, more abundant, than any family gathering they had experienced in years, a realization that deepened both awe and shame. They were outsiders in a war-torn world, yet welcomed, however briefly, into warmth, community, and celebration. As the evening drew on, Fisher and Bauer noticed that American adults moved with quiet attentiveness, observing the children, ensuring safety and decorum, but allowing freedom and play. This subtle combination of structure and liberty created an almost hypnotic effect on the prisoners, an order that was neither oppressive nor punitive, and a kindness that felt deliberate yet unforced. It was a concept difficult to reconcile with all they had been taught about the enemy. The prisoners lingered, reluctant to withdraw, as the snow continued to fall in silent, weightless flakes. The faint glow of lanterns, the distant hum of music, and the soft voices of children created a tableau of warmth and normalcy that challenged every preconception the men had carried across the Atlantic. Can joy exist where war has promised only sorrow? The question pressed against them as the lights twinkled and music faded into the night, leaving the POWs to reconcile delight with guilt and wonder with fear under the cold expanse of an unfamiliar winter sky. The morning sun reflected sharply off the snow-laden fields surrounding the POW camp, casting a bright, almost blinding glare across frost-tipped fences and the wooden barracks. German prisoners, bundled in standard-issue wool coats, thick gloves, and worn leather boots, moved cautiously along the courtyard, their footsteps leaving deep impressions in powdery drifts. Yet the chill did little to suppress a sense of restless energy that had been building in the stillness of the long winter months. A sudden shriek of laughter drew attention to a group of children beyond the perimeter fence. They were gleefully tossing snowballs at one another, red-cheeked and bundled against the wind in knitted caps and heavy coats. One boy, catching sight of the prisoners, scooped up a fistful of snow and lobbed it playfully toward the nearest barracks window. The projectile struck harmlessly, but the prisoners hesitated only a moment before Private Otto Fisher, with a tentative grin, responded with his own snowball, flinging it back across the yard. The moment was electric. Corporal Heinrich Bauer watched as others followed suit, first hesitantly, then with growing abandon. Guards, initially observing from the edges of the courtyard, soon found themselves caught in the laughter and chaos, bending low to scoop up snow, joining in the playful exchange. The rigid hierarchy of camp life seemed momentarily suspended, rifles and strict routines replaced by the simple, universal language of play. Snow clumps flew unevenly through the air, some narrowly missing wooden posts or barracks walls, others striking boots and shoulders with a sharp, cold impact. Fingers numbed quickly despite gloves, cheeks burned red from exertion, and the prisoners' laughter, though tentative at first, began to rise in genuine, childlike tones. The snowball fight, spontaneous and unplanned, revealed instincts buried beneath years of discipline and indoctrination. Camaraderie, competition, and the fleeting thrill of physical activity unburdened by orders or expectation. Yet beneath the exhilaration, a subtle tension persisted. Each burst of laughter carried with it an undercurrent of guilt. Memories of destroyed homes, starved families, and winter hardships in Germany intruded upon the joy of the moment. Some prisoners paused mid-throw, staring at the whiteness of the snow and wondering if indulgence in such trivial happiness was permissible or even moral while loved ones suffered. The dissonance between delight and responsibility gnawed at their consciousness. Observers from the nearby farm also joined carefully, offering encouragement and small pieces of bread to the participants. Their presence was gentle, patient, and inclusive, amplifying both the joy and the psychological tension. Every throw of a snowball, every burst of laughter, highlighted the contrast between American openness and the prisoners' expectations of suspicion and cruelty. It was an experience simultaneously liberating and unsettling. By mid-morning, breathless and red-faced, the men paused to rest, leaning against snow-covered fences and barracks walls. The snow lay thick on the ground, dotted with footprints and flattened mounds from countless snowballs. For a fleeting moment, the prisoners felt a fragile connection to the world beyond barbed wire, to a humanity they had long been trained to deny. Yet the laughter, so pure and unguarded, left them vulnerable, aware of the emotional walls that had begun to crumble and the inner conflict that accompanied every smile. Could laughter ever be allowed in captivity? The question lingered in the cold air, unanswered, as the prisoners huddled together to catch their breath, realizing that joy could coexist with guilt, and that even in a world defined by war, fleeting human delight could still pierce the frost of fear and expectation. The barracks were unusually still that morning, the only sound the faint creak of snow-laden roofs and the distant scraping of boots along icy paths outside. German POWs, huddled over wooden desks and benches, dipped pens into inkwells or clutched sharpened pencils, their breaths visible in the cold air. Outside, the world lay blanketed in white, softening the harsh lines of fences, watchtowers, and barracks alike. It was within this fragile quiet that the men dared to confront thoughts they had long suppressed. Private Otto Fisher unfolded a sheet of coarse paper, the ink quickly thickening in the chill. Letters home was censored, scrutinized, and delayed for weeks. Yet he found solace in the act of writing, even if the words would never leave the camp. He wrote of the snow, its serene whiteness, the quiet it imposed, and of small human gestures he had witnessed: children offering gifts, neighbors smiling, and guards treating prisoners with patience. Each line captured wonder, confusion, and a gnawing guilt that the world he described was so far removed from the war-torn streets and rationed tables of Germany. Corporal Heinrich Bauer, seated opposite Fisher, kept a small leather journal, scrawling reflections that would remain hidden. He noted the tension between gratitude and indoctrinated loyalty, a psychological tug-of-war intensified by winter's silence. "How can one feel warmth from those we were told are enemies?" he wrote. The soft glow of snow through the windows illuminated his handwriting, emphasizing the quiet intimacy of the moment. Even the simplest of gestures, the scratch of pen on paper, the curl of breath rising in the cold, felt profound against the backdrop of war. Other prisoners scribbled furtive notes to themselves, exploring feelings they dared not voice aloud. Some questioned whether they truly belonged to the moral framework that had been imposed upon them since enlistment. Obedience, hatred of the enemy, unquestioned duty, observing kindness, fairness, and unexpected generosity. They wrestled with a new concept that humanity could exist independent of ideology, that decency might not be a threat, but an invitation to reconsider long-held beliefs. The camp permitted limited privacy for correspondence, typically at scheduled hours and within shared rooms, but the barracks were quiet that day, giving the men a rare respite. Paper was coarse, ink often thickened by the cold, and pencils sometimes dulled against the rough texture of the writing surface. Yet these limitations only amplified the significance of each word. Every note, journal entry, or fleeting thought became an act of introspection, a deliberate confrontation with the internal dissonance provoked by decency in a land they had expected to embody only hostility. Fisher glanced up through frost-lined windows at the snow drifting slowly from gray skies. Each flake seemed suspended in time, as though the world itself encouraged reflection. He felt a cautious, unaccustomed empathy toward those who had treated him with care, coupled with unease that such feelings might betray his sense of loyalty. The duality of gratitude and guilt weighed heavily, making the simple act of writing both cathartic and torturous. The prisoners wrote in silence, minds active and hearts unsettled. No voices disturbed the stillness. No orders interrupted the fragile process of moral reckoning. Outside, children's laughter from distant farms occasionally punctuated the quiet, reminding them that human warmth persisted even in frozen landscapes. Each scribbled sentence became a negotiation between past teachings and present reality, a tentative acknowledgement that the enemy might be human and, perhaps, morally admirable. Can loyalty survive exposure to decency? The question lingered in the barracks, as the snow cast long shadows across desks and journals. The men continued to write, to reflect, to confront the subtle psychological awakening that had begun amid winter's quiet, an awakening that would shape not only their perception of Americans, but their understanding of themselves. The snow muffled every sound as German POWs ventured beyond the camp perimeter, their boots sinking into drifts along narrow forest paths. The landscape was transformed into an immaculate winter tableau. Branches bowed under the weight of fresh snow. Frozen streams glimmered faintly beneath thin sheets of ice, and the distant horizon was softened by a mist that blurred the line between earth and sky. Each step elicited a faint crunch, the solitary rhythm a stark contrast to the thunder of artillery and marching boots that haunted their memories. Private Otto Fisher noted the deer tracks etched into the fresh snow, delicate impressions that suggested cautious movement through the dense woods. The animals themselves remained hidden, yet their presence was felt in the air, a fleeting rustle, a subtle shift of branches. Fisher's gaze lingered on a fox darting between the trees, its russet coat incongruous against the white backdrop. Each sighting prompted awe, tinged with a cautious fear. Nature was beautiful, yet unpredictable, as merciless as the battlefields they had left behind. Corporal Heinrich Bauer observed the frozen stream, water trapped beneath a fragile layer of ice. He traced its curves with his eyes, noting the way the sunlight reflected off small crystalline formations along the edges. In Germany or occupied territories, forests had long been associated with ambushes, danger, and the unknown. Here, the woods were quiet, almost reverent. The prisoners were unsettled by the absence of threat, the peace of the environment forcing reflection upon their own humanity and the contrasts between expectation and reality. The flora was equally remarkable. Evergreen pines and spruces, dusted with powdery snow, towered above the men, while smaller shrubs and bushes bent under the weight of frost. Bauer reached down to brush snow from a cluster of red-berried holly, its vibrant color startling against the monochrome landscape. He realized that such beauty was untouched by human conflict, a reminder that life continued even amid war. The dichotomy between the serenity of the forest and memories of firebombed towns and frozen trenches created a quiet tension, demanding introspection. Fisher paused, allowing silence to settle around him. The muffled world encouraged thought, letters unread, families struggling, moral conflicts, and the unusual kindness of strangers in a foreign land. Nature, in its impartial magnificence, seemed to offer lessons no drill, punishment, or propaganda could convey. The snow laid a blanket not only across the landscape, but also across the rigid boundaries of indoctrinated thought. For a fleeting moment, war's rigid categories, friend, enemy, duty, blurred in the presence of something timeless and impartial. The prisoners continued walking, careful to leave minimal traces in the unbroken snow. Occasional footprints, both human and animal, marked the path, evidence of life that existed independently of conflict. Birds, muted in winter plumage, flitted from branch to branch, and the quiet drip of melting icicles punctuated the air with subtle rhythm. Each sound, each movement, underscored the contrast between chaos and calm, fear and serenity, duty and introspection. By the time they returned to camp, their faces flushed from exertion and cold, a shared sense of quiet reflection lingered. The woods had offered more than exercise. They had provided perspective. The prisoners were aware of their own evolving perceptions, of kindness, of beauty, and of the possibility that peace could exist in small, tangible moments. Nature, impartial and unjudging, had become a mirror for conscience and a lens for moral questioning. Could nature teach lessons the battlefield never could? The thought persisted as they crossed back into the camp, snow crunching beneath boots and the forest receding behind them, leaving a lingering sense that human kindness and personal reflection might, like the silent forest, endure beyond the immediate turmoil of war. The barracks were hushed, the usual clatter of boots and conversations replaced by the soft whisper of snow brushing against the roof and the occasional groan of wooden beams contracting in the cold. German POWs huddled near small stoves, their breath misting in the frigid air as they attempted to occupy themselves with routine tasks, mending clothing, cleaning gear, or quietly reading letters received days or weeks prior. Outside, the landscape was pristine, draped in unbroken snow, a mirror of calm that both soothed and unsettled the prisoners. Private Otto Fisher unfolded a letter from home, its edges brittle, ink slightly smudged from winter moisture. The read of rationed meals, bombed-out homes, and the struggle for warmth in Germany, and a deep knot of guilt twisted in his stomach. The generosity of Americans, the playful snowball fights, and the quiet kindness of children and guards, all experiences so foreign and dissonant, now collided violently with his sense of duty. How could he feel joy in a land where, by his understanding, he should only feel fear, anger, and hostility? Corporal Heinrich Bauer sat opposite him, staring blankly at frost-laden windows. He thought of conversations he had with fellow prisoners the night before, debates over whether the warmth and smiles extended to them were genuine or manipulative. The camp's propaganda, drilled relentlessly into their minds for years, had taught them to perceive the American as a calculating adversary. Yet every act of civility, every shared meal, every note of laughter challenged that conditioning. The ideological lines that once delineated friend from foe had blurred, leaving them in an uncomfortable gray zone. The internal conflict was palpable. Some men whispered furtively in corners, wrestling with guilt over feeling comforted and even happy. Others maintained a rigid facade, suppressing reactions to maintain loyalty to indoctrination. Yet even the most disciplined soldiers could not completely hide a softened gaze, a brief smile, or a quiet sigh at the sight of untouched snow outside. The natural world, indifferent to human divisions, provided a stark contrast to the chaos of war and the rigid moral codes they had been trained to uphold. Letters, both sent and received, compounded their unease. Many prisoners had written of longing and sorrow but hesitated to express subtle gratitude for the kindness they encountered. Could they admit that Americans, the very people they were taught to hate, had offered genuine care? And if they admitted it, what did that say about their loyalty? The question festered quietly, gnawing at conscience and leaving a lingering tension in every interaction between themselves, their peers, and the world outside the fences. Propaganda, previously unshakable, now collided with lived experience. The meticulous accounts of cruelty that had once guided their perceptions seemed exaggerated in light of snow-dusted barns, smiling faces, and unguarded gestures of goodwill. Joy, they realized, was no longer a simple act of defiance or indulgence. It had become a moral battlefield, one fought within the mind itself. Each laugh, each smile, each moment of quiet reflection became both a reward and a punishment, a test of conscience against years of ideological conditioning. As evening fell, the barracks darkened, save for the faint glow of a single oil lamp. Fisher and Bauer sat in silence, listening to the muffled crunch of snow outside and the distant hum of activity beyond the fence. Their thoughts circled endlessly about family, duty, morality, and the dangerous intimacy of kindness. They were no longer only prisoners of geography, they were prisoners of conscience, navigating a landscape as treacherous as any battlefield. Can conscience survive where ideology once ruled? The question lingered in the cold, still air, unresolved, as the POWs faced the long winter night, confronting an enemy within themselves that was far more complex and unforgiving than any they had known beyond the snow-covered fences. The frost retreated slowly across the camp, leaving behind a mosaic of slush, puddles, and thawing rivers that cut through the surrounding farmland. Footprints of men, animals, and fleeting moments of snowball skirmishes were now darkened impressions, the ephemeral traces of winter gradually dissolving into the damp earth. German POWs moved carefully through the softening terrain, boots squelching in slushy paths, their eyes occasionally lingering on the remnants of snow-laden trees and frozen streams that had so recently seemed pristine and eternal. Private Otto Fisher paused near the edge of a partially thawed pond, recalling the first snowfall, the icy trains, the serene forests, the tentative smiles of children, and the cautious warmth of American farmers. The events felt distant, yet every sensory detail, the crunch of snow underfoot, the cold bite of air in the lungs, the glint of frost on fences was vivid. It was a season that had left an indelible mark upon both memory and conscience, a period during which the prisoners had confronted the unexpected kindness of those they had been trained to hate. Corporal Heinrich Bauer watched as the camp resumed its routine. Barracks were cleaned, stoves stoked, and labor assignments resumed with renewed efficiency. The thawed environment revealed the practicalities of winter. Frozen water troughs now flowing, paths cleared of ice, and fences damp but intact. Yet beneath these mundane activities, an undercurrent of reflection persisted. Every man was aware that their perceptions had shifted, that the ideological rigidity imposed by years of training was now in tension with lived experience. They had seen civility, fairness, and genuine care, and those observations could not easily be dismissed. Letters sent and received during winter had amplified this awareness. Fisher and Bauer exchanged quiet nods, recalling moments of joy and unease. Snowball fights with children, shared meals with locals, and the serene walks through the silent forest. Each memory carried moral weight, a reminder that kindness could both comfort and unsettle. They wondered whether such lessons could endure beyond the camp, beyond the fences, and into homes scarred by bombings, rationing, and grief. The natural world itself mirrored their internal state. Thawed streams babbled quietly, carrying remnants of frost downstream. Birds returned to bare branches, cautiously calling to one another as the landscape shifted from white to muted earth tones. The contrast between the snow's fleeting perfection and the permanence of human struggle mirrored the prisoner's own conflict. Fleeting moments of clarity and moral awakening set against the enduring backdrop of war and indoctrination. As the day progressed, preparations for transport and eventual repatriation became tangible. Luggage was packed, belongings examined, and the orderly rhythm of the camp emphasized the imminence of departure. Yet no one moved with complete certainty. Each man carried the weight of reflection, the knowledge that snow and stillness had revealed aspects of humanity previously unconsidered. Guilt lingered alongside gratitude, nostalgia intertwined with moral inquiry, and a subtle fear arose about reintegration into societies torn by destruction and loss. Fisher looked once more at the slushy courtyard, imagining the same space in months past, white, silent, and immaculate. He realized that snow, in its quiet way, had taught lessons that battlefields never could, about patience, empathy, and the complexity of human nature. Bauer's gaze followed his, and for a moment, both men were silent, contemplating the tenuous bridge between duty and conscience, between indoctrination and moral awakening. Would these lessons endure when winter and captivity ended? The question hovered as the prisoners returned to routine, the thawed landscape a fragile reminder that even fleeting beauty and decency could leave a permanent imprint on the mind. Yet survival and war awaited beyond the fences. The camp lay quiet beneath a thin layer of remaining frost, the final traces of winter lingering across rooftops and rail tracks. German POWs moved slowly through the grounds, glancing at the familiar barracks, the frost-silvered fences, and the paths where snow had once muffled every sound. There was no hurry. The train scheduled for their repatriation would not depart until the following day, allowing a final moment of reflection before the long journey home. Private Otto Fisher paused near the edge of the yard, observing distant fields stretching into the horizon. Patches of ice glimmered faintly in the sun, and the skeletal outlines of trees marked the borders of farmland. The silence was profound, yet layered with memory. Snowball fights with children, quiet walks through nearby forests, shared meals with farmers, and the rare laughter of men discovering childlike joy amid captivity. Each recollection carried weight, a reminder that war had not solely defined their existence during these months. Corporal Heinrich Bauer walked alongside Fisher, both men noting the subtle transformations within themselves. They had arrived expecting cruelty, deprivation, and isolation, but the reality had been different. Unexpected generosity, kindness without expectation, and moments of connection that defied ideological instruction. The moral dissonance had been difficult to navigate, yet it had left an enduring imprint and understanding that human decency could exist even across lines drawn by conflict. Camp life continued with quiet efficiency as men packed personal belongings, prepared for transport, and received final instructions from guards. Repatriation procedures were meticulously documented: prisoner manifests, health inspections, and arrangements for rail and sea transport. Though the men were technically returning to wartime Germany, their minds lingered on the lessons of their temporary home. Snow, once a source of cold and apprehension, had become a symbol of purity, reflection, and unexpected empathy. The prisoners' thoughts frequently returned to the Americans who had treated them with civility, farmers who shared warm meals, children who offered small gifts, guards who enforced rules with fairness rather than cruelty. These memories contrasted sharply with the propaganda that had framed every foreign gesture as suspect or malicious. Yet the truth had been undeniable. Kindness, simple and human, had endured, teaching lessons that no drill, order, or battlefield experience could convey. Letters carried home would relay the tangible facts: safe transport, rations, and camp conditions, but they could scarcely capture the subtler revelations: the internal struggle, the fragile reconciliation between duty and conscience, and the quiet appreciation for humanity. Fisher considered the impact of these months on his own moral framework. For the first time, he understood that war's most formidable challenges were not only measured in bullets or strategy, but in the capacity to navigate empathy, reflection, and cultural shock while bound by circumstance. As the last day of departure approached, the men lingered near the edge of the camp one final time. Footprints in the slush traced the passage of countless small moments: hurried steps across icy courtyards, careful exploration of snow-dusted paths, and the occasional playful chase among peers. These marks, ephemeral yet meaningful, mirrored the internal traces left on their minds and hearts. They were leaving not only a camp, but a crucible of moral awakening, the memory of snow intertwined with lessons of generosity, trust, and human connection. The whistle of the approaching train cut through the stillness, signaling the journey ahead. The POWs mounted the cars with quiet solemnity, glancing once more at the familiar yet transformed landscape. They carried memories of laughter, reflective walks, and small acts of kindness that had challenged their assumptions, reshaped their perception of humanity, and left indelible psychological impressions. As the snow melted and the POWs prepared to leave, they carried with them lessons no battlefield could teach. Kindness can be more powerful than any weapon, and even in war, humanity finds a way to endure. The first snow fell quietly, leaving traces on hearts that war could not erase. If you were moved or surprised by this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to explore more untold secrets from the world's most intense conflicts. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have felt if you were in their place? On Battlefield Secrets, history isn't just dates and battles, it's the human stories that the world forgot.